In every facet of life, freedom is the holy grail that everyone's chasing after. Freedom to define who you are, who you want to be, how you want to be seen. Now, of course, we want to say that many freedoms, free speech or free trade or freedom from slavery or freedom to vote, all of those things are obviously good and wonderful and things which we should absolutely contend for. But what I want to address is the idea of freedom, which is to do with autonomous individualism. Maybe we could call it the Disney freedom philosophy, because their biggest star of the last 10 years once sang this, and it got stuck in everyone's heads. No rights, no wrongs, no rules for me, I'm free. Queen Elsa singing of how she's free from the shackles of rules and regulations, free from societal pressure to conform to a stereotype, free to live how you want and with who you want. Isn't that just the liturgy of our secular age? I'm free to think or believe or live or play or sleep with or act or desire whatever I like, so long as it doesn't cause harm to anyone else, and you can't tell me otherwise. And as a result, certainly in the West, freedom is now seen as the ultimate moral good. In fact, something is only immoral if it's restricting someone's freedom. Two things I'd love us to consider. Firstly, that we're not as free as we might think. And secondly, that there's a better freedom on offer for all who want it. And actually, to help us consider those statements, we're going to go to the pages of the Bible and to John's historical account of Jesus' life. And as we do, just listen to what Jesus says about freedom to some Jewish leaders who are listening into him. He says this. He says, "If you hold to my teaching, you're really my disciples. And then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." So can you see what Jesus is saying? That if you hold to his teaching, then you'll be free. Now you might be thinking, well, hang on, how does that work? How does holding on to, or how does being constrained by someone's teaching make you free? That sounds like the very opposite of freedom. And actually, that's how Christianity is seen today, isn't it? It's seen as a straitjacket. It's seen as a moral law that binds people. It's hardly liberating. And so how on earth can Jesus say, if you hold to my teaching, then you'll know the truth, which will set you free? That's quite a claim. And actually the crowd respond to Jesus, if you read it in John's account, in a similar way. John writes this. It says, "They answered him, 'We're Abraham's descendants. We've never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?'" You can imagine someone saying that today, right? Set me free. I'm no slave. I'm an independent woman. I'm a man who's the master of my own fate. What do we need setting free from? But Jesus wants those listening in to know that there was something that they were enslaved to that they didn't even realize. Jesus goes on to say this. He says, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." Now, what's Jesus talking about here? Well, I guess the first question we're going to ask is, what is sin? What does Jesus mean when he says we're enslaved to sin? Often we think that sin is simply doing bad stuff, cheating on a tax return, road rage, that kind of thing. But sin is actually much, much deeper than that. And fundamentally, we see in the Bible that sin is rejecting God and turning to something else. In fact, it's seeking freedom from God's good rule. But the trouble is, in doing so, we've just gone and got ourselves enslaved to a worse master. Think of it this way. By nature, we all now look to something other than God to build our life around. We all live for something, be it your career or people's approval or a relationship. And whatever is the object of that pursuit ultimately controls us. We're enslaved to it. We might think that we're autonomous, free-spirited individuals, but we are all controlled by something. And because it's not what we were made for, it's destructive. Here's novelist David Foster Wallace. This guy's not a Christian, but he gets something of this. He writes this. He says, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships, or in other words, everyone's bound to something. Nobody's free. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason, he writes, for choosing some sort of God or spiritual thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. Worship power, and you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. That's how he puts it, and he's kind of got it, hasn't he? He's saying that we all make something the ultimate thing in our life that we look to for meaning or hope or joy, and that thing, it constrains us, it enslaves us, and it's miserable. Because ultimately it always disappoints. When we turn to something other than God to worship, when we make something other than God the epicenter around which our world revolves, as Wallace says, it ultimately eats us alive. We never have enough. It's just misery and disappointment as the purpose and the satisfaction and the identity that we crave from those things never delivers. And so we are all enslaved by, we are all under the control of something. Okay, so the question is, if we're all under the control of something, if we are all constrained, then what we really all need is to find the best constraints to live under. That's consistent, right? It's a bit like this. Imagine being a whale. Okay, a whale might think that freedom equals living outside of the constraints of the water. All right, imagine you're a whale, you've been bound by the South Pacific Ocean for so long, for years and years you've seen seals and penguins and all sorts enjoying running around and flapping on the land, and you think, well, that is freedom, surely. Being outside of this wretched ocean, on the land. And this whale, you're well versed in the philosophy of Elsa from Frozen, and so you think, well, I'm a modern whale, I'm free to do what I like, no rights, no wrongs, no rules for me, it's not hurting anyone for me to leave the constraints of the South Pacific Ocean. I'm free to do what I want. And so one day you flop out of the ocean onto the nearest floating iceberg, and finally, after years and years, you're free from the shackles of the sea. You can see where the story's going, right? Because within a few minutes, it doesn't actually look quite so liberating as it did before, and ultimately, the whale dies. What you thought was freedom was just another form of constraint. What the whale really needed was the right constraint of the ocean. That's what the whale was designed for. That's where the whale will flourish, where the whale will enjoy life to its fullest and live as he was made to live when he's swimming around in the depths of the Pacific, not when he's flapping about on an iceberg. And so for us, we were made by God and for him. Living for anything else is slavery. Living for God means being what we were made to be. It's the whale swimming in the ocean. It's freedom. As Justin Whitmore Earley writes in his excellent little book, The Common Rule, he says, what if the good life doesn't come from having the ability to do what we want, but from having the ability to do what we were made for? What if true freedom comes from choosing the right limitations, not avoiding all limitations? And so the message of the Bible is this, okay? True freedom is found in being in right relationship with God, living under his loving rule in obedience to him as we were made for. And so here's the final piece of the puzzle, okay? How do we get back there? How do we get back to relationship with God? Our slavery to sin is not something that we have the kind of power or the mental fortitude to just turn away from. We're enslaved by it. No, we need someone else to come and to set us free. Back to that passage that John writes, listen to what Jesus goes on to say. He says, if the Son, that is Jesus, sets you free, you will be free indeed. And this is the phenomenal message of the Christian faith, that Jesus the Son, he came to set people free to be part of God's family. How did he do that? Well, remember our problem? That we are by nature enslaved to sin, that we've turned away from God to worship other things. And the Bible reminds us that this rightly deserves God's punishment. But God, out of his great love for us, sends his son Jesus to come and take the punishment that we deserve in our place. Jesus came and he gave up his freedom. He was nailed to a cross such that he literally couldn't move. And in doing so, he took upon himself all of God's anger at our sins so that whoever now believes in him can be free. Free from the guilt and the consequence of sin. It is all taken by Jesus at the cross. Free from condemnation. Instead, God looks at us as his beloved children, sons and daughters. Free from the curse of death, as it only serves us now to be in heaven with Jesus forever. Free from having to spend our lives scratching around in the dirt, looking for meaning and hope and satisfaction in all these places that fail to hit the spot, as we are restored back to what we were made for, freedom of life with God. All of these things and 1,000 other reasons are why being a Christian is wonderfully good news.